And and without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor to Charlene Quint, who is the author of that book that Sally was holding up a minute ago. Overcome. Can you show that really quickly, Sally?
It's
Yeah, over.
overcoming the narcissist, sociopath, psychopath, and other domestic abusers.
Yeah, and Charlene runs an entire ministry for domestic abuse victims, and has a lot she can talk about with all that. She's an attorney herself, represents victims, and just runs a wonderful ministry. So yeah, I'm going to give the floor to her. Thank you very much, Charlene.
Well, thank you for having me, Colin, and welcome. I'm going to start out by letting us all know that this is a really uncomfortable subject, and there's going to be things that are going to make us all squirm a little bit, and I may say some things that repeat things that abusers do that make us all somewhat uncomfortable. So I want to put that out in front, because we're called to be a light in the darkness, and this is a particularly dark area, but this is how it is. So I'm just going to start with that, and again, thank you for inviting me here, and we're going to I'll answer all questions at the end, but let me just start with a quick personal story and how I originally got involved in this domestic abuse ministry and representing victims of domestic abuse. April 6th of 2012 is my Independence Day. I went into hiding for 2.5 years on that day. 3 months before, I had written my then husband a 15-page letter outlining his abuses over the 20-year marriage and asking him to change. I talked about his emotional abuse, and I reminded him of unreasonable demands. He always had to be right. He gave me the silent treatment for weeks. He sabotaged things. There was over 100 threats of divorce. He was just mean, gaslighting, projection, and he was proud of the fact that he was mean. I outlined his financial abuse, this prenuptial agreement that I had to sign the day before the wedding after I had already quit my job that he had asked me to do. So it was very pre-planned. I had no access to any marital funds based on this prenuptial agreement. Everything was his. And after 20 years of marriage to a multimillionaire, I had no assets. I outlined his physical abuse, leaving me stranded on the streets of Chicago, 35 miles from home, in the middle of December, with no coat, no phone, and no money. And I had to somehow get myself back home. So I stated that those were just some examples, but I went through 20 years history, and I said, this is not how a Christian man treats his wife. And I asked him to get some counseling. And instead of that, he just laughed and mocked me. And he said, well, it's not that bad. If it was that bad, you would have left 10 years ago. And instead of getting counseling, he went and got a prescription for Viagra. And every night after the kids went to bed, and every morning after they went to school, he tied me to the 4 posters of his 4-poster bed with belts, and he raped me every day until the day I left. And finally, I said, this is not changing. I've got to get out. And April 6, 2012 is the day I packed a little overnight bag and put it in the trunk of my car, left like I was going for work, and never went back, and went into hiding. Nobody knew where I was. I called the senior pastor, and we met, and he pawned me off on a director with no counseling experience, no ordination. They allowed my husband to continue attending church. They tried marriage counseling. Even after he admitted to everything I had put in the letter, I showed them the letter, and even after they saw the documents, and even after they saw the pictures of rape that I showed them. The director, who was on our case, I guess, wrote these apology letters for my husband, but they didn't reflect my husband's heart. They were his heart. So that was confusing for me to see a person who wasn't sincere about changing have these beautifully written letters that were just not him. He never repented. He never changed. And when I filed for divorce, he wouldn't even honor that same prenuptial agreement that he made me sign. it got very, very ugly. He lied, of course, about me and told everybody. He played the pity card like they all do. And he said I left because I had an affair. He said I abandoned him. And then he said I was crazy and had mental health issues. And then he turned my friends at church away. They somehow believed him. And I got nasty grams from my church friends and slander. My own children didn't talk to me, one for 2 years. And he stayed in the church, but I had to leave because, of course, it wasn't safe for me. They allowed him to stay. And then he targeted wealthy widows for the next wife, and he found one to marry. And after the senior pastor told me that he wouldn't marry him in church, he then went back and did marry him in church. And so that's when I thought, I'm just done with this church. I need to terminate my membership here and find a church that really follows Christ. And that wasn't it. The church had become a safe haven for wolves and not protecting its own sheep. I had to get in my own order of protection, even after I was divorced. And ironically, it got violated when I tried to go to that church for a Christmas service, and he would not leave. So, wow, what I came out of this situation just completely devastated, alone. I had lost my marriage, my home, my church, half of the church friends, quote, and my family, but I still had God. And I thought, what do I do with all this? So as an attorney, what do? We look for answers. So I did research. I did thousands of hours of research, and this is what I found. I found that there is a certain section of the population, about 10%, give or take, that have these cluster B personality disorders, narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, from where we get the terms narcissist and sociopaths and psychopaths. So they are functioning narcissists and sociopaths and psychopaths. And mental health professionals have to call it something, right? So they've given this label, but for those of us who are people of faith, we call it evil. I also discovered that 90% of abusers are male. And these narcissists and sociopaths don't respond to counseling because they don't want to change. They have a complete rejection of God and his values. And those that do go to perpetrator counseling have a success rate of near 0%. They have these perpetrator counseling programs, but they really aren't successful. The primary characteristics of these people is that there's no empathy, there's no conscience, there's no remorse, there's pathological lying. They use people as objects for their selfish gain. They purposely try to destroy their partner. They're sadistic. They take joy in hurting other people. They have this desire for power and control over others. We know they're Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. They're charming to others, but behind closed doors, they're monster-like. They use wives as their own personal prostitutes, and they're porn addicts. We know these things. I also discovered that there's a lot more to domestic abuse than I thought. There's emotional abuse, which happens in 100% of abusive relationships. And there's financial abuse, which happens in 99% of abusive relationships when the spouses have no access to funds. Physical abuse happens in 98% of the time. Abusive relationships, but it doesn't always mean that they have bruises. There is lots of physical abuse that doesn't result in bruises. For example, leaving me on the streets of Chicago in the middle of the night, or not taking someone to the hospital when they have for emergencies, or when they're in labor with a baby, or otherwise vulnerable. There's sexual abuse, and that happens in 68% of the time. And 80% of those situations, it's repeated time and time again. And of course, for anyone whose faith is important to them, there's spiritual abuse, where they use the scriptures to justify their abuse and make her stay. I learned that, of course, they're predators, so they target lovely Christian women. And I learned that there was this romantic relationship cycle. So that the love bombing, they first start off with the love bombing, pretending to be somebody that they're not, to get her attached financially and emotionally to him. And then once you say I do, or buy a house together, or have a baby together, or somehow become financially intertwined, they go into this devaluation stage, where the real abuse comes out. And then finally the discard stage, where she's no longer useful to him, and he, discards her like yesterday's newspaper, and then starts with a new one, and then repeats the process. And then I found that this devaluation cycle has a cycle within the cycle. We talk about the cycle of abuse, and there's this explosion of abuse that happens. And whether it's a verbal or physical abuse, and then there's this period sometimes of maybe you get an apology, or maybe you get promises to change, or maybe you just get, better behavior for a while. And so that they're on good behavior for a little while, and the partner thinks, oh, well, maybe there's hope, and maybe he's sorry, and maybe this won't happen again. But then eventually there's this increase in tension, and she's now walking on eggshells, and there's another explosion, and then the process just repeats itself. And then, of course, we find out that he's intent on destroying her, especially after she tries to leave. So what's the effect on families and victims? Well, we know from studies that 100% of the women have post-traumatic stress disorder, and more than 80% of that is moderate to severe. And I don't want to keep saying just women as the victims and men as the perpetrators, but I'm going to use those personal pronouns, because we know that over 90% are men. And so I apologize to the good men that are on this call and those that are listening to it, but because the statistics are so overwhelming, that's how I'm going to be discussing it. We know that the victims have hopelessness and depression and feelings of worthlessness. They feel like they can't get out. They often turn to alcohol and drugs. They're just in a sense of despair. We know that it takes a cognitive toll. They can't concentrate or focus like they used to be able to do, because all of their cognitive energy is focused on trying to survive and get through the day. So 80% of victims have problems at work due to missing work, or coming in late, or not being able to focus, and trying to protect their children when they have issues. We know that this is what Christians would call a generational sin, because children learn it from their parents as they live in these abusive situations. And so we find out that boys are far more likely to be abusers themselves when they grow up, and girls are far more likely to choose an abusive partner as she grows up, until someone stands up and breaks that chain of abuse. We know it's a global problem. Just in this country, we know that 35% of women will experience stalking or severe physical abuse or rape in her lifetime. And we know that 48% of women will experience verbal or emotional abuse or coercive control. And those numbers are just they're flabbergasting, right? I mean, they're more than, if we've looked at all of the forms of cancer combined, they wouldn't be that much. This is an epidemic. We know domestic abuse is the #1 killer of women in the world. And we also know that women of faith stay in these relationships significantly longer than women without faith, because they are so desiring to not break their vows. They want to do what God wants them to do, and they want to be a good Christian woman. So I often get the question, well, why didn't she just leave? Why didn't she stay? Well, here's why she stays. The #1 reason is finances. She has no access to funds. She's been forced out of the job market by her husband, who does not want her to have access to money, because we know that money is power, and he knows money is power. So he's asked her nicely. It's like, oh, you don't have to work, honey. I make plenty of money. I'll provide for the both of us. And she thinks, oh, how wonderful. I can stay home and spend time with the children. And so she thinks this is a win-win, until he starts using that against her. And then eventually it's like, oh, you're stupid, you're ignorant, you're this, because you don't bring anything in. And so then that gets used against her, and she has no access to that. Another reason why she stays, she hopes that Prince Charming, that wonderful person that was in the love bombing stage, will return. Maybe if she's just nicer or prettier or sexier or loses weight or does something more pleasing to him, that wonderful person is going to return. But she doesn't realize that that person never existed. He just pretended to be Mr. Wonderful until he snagged her and got her in his claws. She thinks that praying some more is going to help, right? Because, prayer answers everything, but she doesn't realize that God doesn't, he doesn't go against people's free will. If people have rejected him, God's a gentleman and he lets them reject him. She thinks that maybe if she goes to enough counseling sessions, this is going to work. And we know that doesn't work either, because he doesn't want to change. Only people who want to change actually get affected by counseling, but he doesn't want to. Another reason why is she's afraid God's going to be mad at her, because everyone she talks to, pastors and other people in church, tell her that, God hates divorce. And so she's afraid that God's going to be mad at her, and she doesn't want to make God mad at her. He might have threatened to kill her, or threatened that she's going to be a bag lady and have absolutely nothing when she leaves. And so that keeps her there. Often people stay for the children. Is it better to leave, or is it better to stay? If you stay, at least you can protect them. You can be the buffer. You can be the person that comes in between him and the children when he gets mad at them and either emotionally or verbally or physically abusive to them. So she can at least be there. And if she is divorced, then she knows the courts are likely to give the children to him, and she won't be there to protect them. But when people eventually leave, it's usually because of the children, and she realizes she can no longer protect the children. And that's usually the impetus for them leaving. So with all of this, you would think that the church and the legal system and friends and family would support her, right? Because she's the one doing all the things to make it work. But no, they don't. They support the abuser, and they try to tell her she should go back to this person who was trying to destroy her. And abusers are such great, they're such great actors that they lie, and he plays them like a fiddle. He will play the pity card. Poor me, my wife has left me. Poor me, I didn't do anything, and she's just abandoned me. He will lie and slander and ostracize her from her church and her support network. And of course, her children, who mean the most to her. He causes a division in the church, and she turns the children against her. He will hide money and claim to be poor. No matter how much he makes, he'll say that he doesn't earn anything and that he doesn't have anything. He could be a millionaire or a pauper, and it's the same story. He will claim, at least to the pastor, that he wants this marriage to work and that he's willing to go to counseling, but he will absolutely refuse to do anything to change, to actually make the marriage work and be healthy. He will use the legal system to financially and emotionally abuse her further. He will make unreasonable demands and not agree to any reasonable settlement. And then he will use the church and to pretend to be a good Christian and cloak himself in an cloak of respectability so that he seems like the good guy. And then he uses the church to draw in the next victim. So why do these people believe him? Well, there's this thing called cognitive dissonance. We want to believe that the people in our circle are good, because that means we're good, right? I mean, we want to believe that our family's good. We want to believe that our church is a good church. We want to believe our country club's a good country club, and the people in our circle are good. But then they hear this opposite story that he's a monster behind closed doors, and they just they can't hold both at the same time. He's either good or he's a monster. So which one is it? So they work overtime in their brains to try to figure this out. And nobody wants to be friends with a monster, right? Nobody wants to be the friend of Jeffrey Epstein. So they're trying very hard to figure this out. So they resolve this cognitive dissonance by saying, well, if he was really a monster, then I'm going to have to change things, right? I can't be his friend. I can't hang out at the country club with him. I'm not going to sit next to him in church. I'm not going to invite him to my social gatherings anymore. My whole life is going to be turned upside down. So what do? We look at the woman and say, oh, well, she's just exaggerating, or she's lying, or, it's taken out of context, or, look at her. She does have mental health issues. So, so they can dismiss the facts that he's saying, well, he's the monster. And then they can go on pretending that he didn't do anything. And yes, he must be the good guy that I thought he was. So I can still hang out at the country club with him and go golfing and sit next to him in church, and we can still continue going out to dinner. And I'll just ignore that little blip over there because she's gone anyway, right? She's left the church, she's left the country club because it was in his name anyway. And she's out of the picture because why? Because it's not safe for her to be there anymore. So that's really one of the reasons why so many people just disbelieve her and side with them. And churches naively think that marriage counseling or appealing to his conscience is going to work, but they don't recognize that marriage counseling doesn't work for people that have abusive tendencies. And it's discouraged by all mental health professionals in cases of abuse. And the issue isn't the marriage relationship. The issue is he has issues. An abuser has issues. Regardless of who he's with, he would have the same issues. So individual counseling is required, first for her to get healthier and him to recognize all the unhealthy thoughts and attitudes of why he's doing what he's doing and being so abusive to his own family. Most pastors don't realize that they don't have a conscience to appeal to, so appealing to it is useless. And a lot of pastors just don't really recognize that someone is intentionally destroying their own family. They just can't wrap their minds around that this is something that is that evil that is happening right in their church. So one of the things people do is they keep praying, well, maybe God will just zap him, and so they pray and pray. Women pray for years, decades, and so do churches, that God will just zap him. But God doesn't zap evil people into being good people. That's not how he works. He lets people who have rejected him reject him, and we find that in Romans 1, right? So if you look through your Bible, there's only 3 people that I have found, maybe you found more, but I've only found 3 who have actually changed from being a really evil person who's rejected God to someone who has completely changed on God's side. Rah, rah, let's go, God. And those are only people that have had such severe consequences that they finally humbled themselves. Paul is the first one that comes to mind. And we all think, oh, what if he's like Paul? What if God decides he's going to be like Paul? All right, okay, great. Paul was one in a bazillion, right? So we can't use him as an example of what is typically going to happen. But look at what happened to Paul. He was blinded. He got put in a 3-year timeout, and he got some severe consequences. But look how he turned out. He completely repented. He became 100% on fire for God, and he told the world, yes, that was me. I was a really bad, horrible person, and look at what God did to me. So he pointed everyone to God, not to him. So if it happens, that's great, but we don't see too many Pauls. King Nebuchadnezzar was another, believe it or not, king of Babylon. In Daniel 4, we found out that when he was so prideful that God turned him insane for 7 years, and he ate grass like a donkey and had claws. And only when he humbled himself and acknowledged God did God return his sanity and his kingdom. So, but again, severe consequences. And finally, King Manasseh, one of the most evil kings in the Old Testament, he was dragged off to Babylon in chains and a nose ring until he finally humbled himself and repented, and God set him free. And then he came back and turned around and did some good things. But those are the only 3 people. Everybody else, he let reject him. And even after they were taken away into exile. We look at an example of Paul and David in the Bible. I mean, Saul pursued David for no reason. David was only good to him. And Saul's own son tried to stand up and say what a good guy his dad was. And David said, no, he's going to kill me. And so he gave them the test. And yes, Saul tried to kill his own son because of of what he said about David, and threw a spear at him and nearly tried to kill him. And then finally Jonathan said, gee, David, you're right. He's crazy. Yeah, you need to get away. And David ran away because he was trying to destroy him. And God never did change Saul's heart. So I get asked all the time, wow, as a Christian, what does redemption look like? And they always want to think, oh, it's going to be like Paul and everything's going to be, butterflies and puppies. And that's really not what redemption looks like in domestic abuse cases. What redemption does look like for domestic abuse cases is really the Israelites escaping from Pharaoh. It's the story of the Exodus. God doesn't change Pharaoh's heart. He is still cruel. It remains hard. Pharaoh doesn't want the Israelites to leave because why? They were great at they were great servants, right? Why would he want to leave, have his servants leave? And plus it's embarrassing when all these people leave. So he didn't want them to leave. So he makes it very hard for them to leave. But God sends Moses and gives his people the strength to get out to the promised land that he has promised for them. They have to go through a few unfortunate years in the desert, and they wouldn't have been that long in the desert if they had just believed his promises and looked forward to his promises, but they didn't believe him, so they were stuck there for 40 years. And that is very much like the story of a Christian woman who's escaping domestic abuse. God doesn't change the heart of someone who rejects him, but that person doesn't want her to leave, not because he loves her, but because he wants the free services. And it's embarrassing when someone divorces their husband, so he's embarrassed. And he just makes it really hard for her to leave. And like the Israelites, sometimes she looks back and think, oh my gosh, this is really hard. I'm stuck in the desert. I really don't know what this desert is, not anything like I had hoped it would be. And maybe it's better to go back. And that's why women go back on average 7 times before they leave for good. But when we look forward to God's promises and believe who he says he is and that he will do what he says he will do, he does have this wonderful land of peace and rest for us. And the more we look forward and believe his promises, the quicker that happens. Like I said, we want redemption to look like Paul, but almost no abusers change. And as we talked, the success rate in perpetrator classes is close to 0%. But I also want to talk about what redemption doesn't look like. Judges 19 and 20 has a story about what it looks like when women return to abuser whose heart hasn't changed. And it's a really ugly story. I'm not going to go through the details here, but I would encourage you to read Judges 19 and 20. And this is so often the case of women that go back to abusers whose heart hasn't changed. He runs after her and pursues her and sweet talks her into returning, sweet talks her dad into letting her go back. She goes back and he's even more abusive than he was before. She eventually dies and he blames everybody else but himself for that. So this is what typically happens when a woman goes back to an abuser who has not repented. And the abuse just escalates because now, why not? She's still here. And if she didn't leave before and she's come back, well, she'll never leave, no matter what he does. So I want to talk a little bit about God's heart in these situations. We know that God's heart he's a God of justice and he's a God of mercy. God hates evil. He really does. He hates evil because it hurts those that he loves. Psalm 34 says the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. 1 Peter 3:12 says the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Psalm 11:5 says the Lord examines the righteous, but the wicked and those who love violence, his soul hates. We know he opposes the proud and the violence. We see that in Psalm 119 and Psalm 31 and Isaiah 2 and James 4, that he is opposed to the proud. And we also know that he supports the widow and the oppressed and the fatherless. And that's throughout the Bible. So this is the heart of God. And if he supports the widow and the fatherless and the oppressed, how much more would he support people not just a widow whose husband is no longer there and supporting her, but someone who's actively trying to destroy her and actively trying to destroy the children. I love that Proverbs 6:16-19 says there are 7 things that God hates. And he says, haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush to evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who stirs up conflict in the community. And all of those things belong as a characteristic of an abuser. And to put in modern day language, he hates arrogance and pride, which says, I'm better than you. Your job is to serve me, so I can treat you any way I want. And that is the root of domestic abuse. It's just this extreme pride that says, I'm better than you. I'm better than God. I don't have to follow any rules. I can treat you however I want. The second thing, he hates emotional abuse, name calling, insults, gaslighting, projection. Things are that are the opposite of the truth of God and how he views his children, which is a universal characteristic of abusers. He hates oppressing or hurting innocent people, which is kind of the gist of domestic abuse. He hates the scheming, wicked heart, the planning to hurt others, the intentionality to hurt others. This is not an accident. It's another universal characteristic of abusers. He hates people taking enjoyment and delight in hurting others. This is the sadistic part of them, where this is a universal characteristic of abusers. And of course, he hates lying, denying, justifying, or minimizing their wrongdoing, blaming others, and manipulation. So we can look at the Bible as well and see what's God's reaction to abusers and those who utterly reject him. As we said, he's a God of mercy, but he's also a God of judgment. And he allows each of us to have free will. He allows us to reject him. And his will is that he doesn't want anyone to perish, but at the same time, he lets evildoers have their own way. So one of his reactions is he lets them go. And we read this in Romans 1, where, he talks about people who've rejected him, and he lets them go to their own way. We read, this is why God lifted off his restraining hand and let them have full expression of their sinful and shameful desires. They were given over to moral depravity, dishonoring their bodies by sexual perversion among themselves, all because they traded the truth of God for a lie. And for this reason, God gave them over to their own disgraceful and vile passions. We can see from the Old Testament and other places that the wicked continue to be wicked. Daniel 12 says, many will be purified and made spotless and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. Jeremiah 13 talks about wicked people. Can an Ethiopian change his skin, or a leopard change his spots? Neither can you do good who are accustomed to doing evil. We find in Psalm 58 that even from birth the wicked go astray, which is right in line with what the diagnosis for sociopaths and psychopaths, because as part of the diagnosis of the DSM-5, you have to see these characteristics early in life. You can't get that diagnosis before the age of 18, but part of that diagnosis is they've had these tendencies from an early age. So that's another reaction that God has. And as we look at Jesus's reaction to people who choose to reject God and do wicked, he doesn't plead with them or beg them to change. We don't see Jesus begging the Pharisees to say, oh, please just see how good I am. I mean, that's kind of our natural reaction. Oh, just plead and beg and grovel with them. But he doesn't do that. He calls them out. And from Matthew 12, he says, I love this. It says, you brood of vipers, how can you who are evil say anything good? For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in him. So, he just calls them out. And then in John 8, he calls them, he calls them children of the devil. If God were your father, you would love me, for I've come here from God. I've not come on my own. God sent me. Why is my language not clear to you? because you are unable to hear what I say. You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. So, he calls them out. And then we see that God doesn't answer their prayers. So Jeremiah 7:16 says, God tells Jeremiah, don't pray for these people, nor offer any plea or petition. Do not plead with me, for I will not listen to you. And we don't like to think of that God says these things, but yes, he's a God of judgment. And he says in Isaiah 59, but your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you so that I will not hear. And John 9 and 1 Peter 3 talks about how he doesn't hear the prayers of those who have rejected him. But what he does do, he doesn't change people who have rejected him, but he equips his believers to fight. Right? And we see that in Ephesians 6. He talks about the armor of God, and he talks about this is what I'm giving you. You are in an evil world, and it's not just against flesh and blood. This is a spiritual battle that you are in, and anyone who's been in this battle knows it's a spiritual battle. And he says, I'm giving you these weapons to fight with. So he gives us the belt of truth. Why? Because the first weapon of Satan is deceit and lies. The breastplate of righteousness. Why? Because the first plate, the second weapon of Satan is this horrible wickedness. So he goes through the whole weaponry that he gives us, the gospel of peace, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, praying in the spirit. And the last thing that I love what he says is he wants prayers to declare things fearlessly. So that's how he wants us to be, fearless in the midst of the fight. We also know that he sends his angel armies to fight for us. I love this vision in 2 Kings 6 when Elisha sees sees the army of God all around him, and his servant can just think, oh, we're doomed. And he says, no, look around you. And so God reveals that he's got this angel army of horses and chariots of fire all around him. And I know that God sends those for us as well. Isaiah 63 says God fights for us. And I love Isaiah 61 because I think this is really the heart of why Jesus came is for the abused and the oppressed, so that he opens the doors of the prison for the prisoner. He sets the captive free. He breaks the chains. He replaces mourning with a crown of beauty for ashes. So that's really the heart and soul of God's heart for us as people who have gone through this, and those who are fighting for people that are in these situations, is Isaiah 61. So I would encourage everyone to take another read of that. So what is appropriate response to a biblical response to domestic abuse? Again, God doesn't zap bad people into being good. And all too often I hear of the wrong approach from pastors. Well, if you would just, they blame the victim. If you would just pray more, if you'd submit more, if you dress nicer, if you a little bit sexier, if you give him some more sex, or, all of this that puts the blame on her, when in fact the blame is the abuse is always the choice of the abuser. It's never what someone else has made them do. It's always that choice. So it just hurts my heart that she gets blamed again for something that she hasn't done, and she's been trying for years, if not decades, to do the right thing. But we look at how we're supposed to approach this matter. It says in Matthew 18, Jesus tells us, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen, you've won them over. If they won't listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen to the church, then treat them as you would a pagan or tax collector. So in modern day language, women typically go through this. They approach their husbands. He says no. Then they try to go see a marriage counselor. That's the one or two others along. And the marriage counselor, if he's worth his salt, will figure out quickly that the abusive person needs to change his ways, but the abusive person, of course, will not want to change his ways. And so then she takes it to the church. And Paul assumes that the church gets it, but most of the time the church doesn't get it. But this is how Jesus says to go out, approach, and if he's not going to listen to any of these people, well, then separate yourself like you would a pagan or a tax collector. 1 Corinthians 5 tells us that when people are in serious non-repentant sin, we should, quote, expel the wicked person from among you. So this is a clear command to not have people in serious unrepentant sin continue within the confines of the church. But I think my favorite one that seems to be the most applicable is 2 Timothy 3. And in this section, Paul describes an abuser to the T. He says, mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. And then he gave us this clear command: have nothing to do with them. Titus 3:10 says, warn a divisive person once, then warn them a second time. After that, have nothing to do with them. Matthew 10 says, if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that town or home and shake off the dust from your feet. We can look at Proverbs and Psalms about not associating with wicked people. So in summary, God is telling us he's releasing. We need to follow his example. Even God releases the people who reject him after he patiently tries to win their heart. He releases them to their own deceitfulness and destruction. And we at some point have to do the same. At some point, a good doctor will try to keep a patient alive as long as possible. But at some point, he will look and say, I'm calling it. And he gives a time of death. And that's the same that we have to do, the time of death of this relationship. As we've done everything we can, and we must call it and let that person go. We also must recognize that the Bible does not say have nothing to do with them, except for the poor wife who must spend the rest of her life in abuse with a man who hates her and tries to destroy her. All the rest of you people, God loves you, and you should get away and stay away from him because it's really bad for you. It's dangerous. But for the poor wife, God doesn't love you. You're stuck with him for the rest of your life. It doesn't say that. Like modern day therapists, they say go no contact and God says the same thing, go no contact, because God knows how dangerous these people are. Every time you have contact with them, it's dangerous, and it's one more way to destroy her. So God recognizes how dangerous they are. So now we're going to go to the big elephant in the room. What about divorce? Oh my goodness. It's in many Christian circles, divorce is the big no matter what. But I want to go through biblically what God says about divorce. God provided, first of all, divorce as a remedy for sins in the Old Testament. The remedies for sins, he gave several remedies for sins. And we look at Leviticus and Deuteronomy, a number of remedies for sins. And the remedy for sin in a marriage for an unrepentant and hardened heart was divorce. And even Jesus admitted that in Matthew 19. like other remedies for sin, divorce is only applied when there's no other way for justice to prevail. It's God's gracious way to allow someone who's no longer loved and no longer cared for, and whose spouse's heart has turned against her, to remove herself from an unhealthy, sinful, abusive relationship. Many people don't recognize that God actually commanded divorce and separation in Ezra when a number of men that had gone back out of captivity from Babylon had gone back, and God said specifically, do not marry the pagan women of this group because of Canaan, because they will turn your hearts against me. And that's exactly what happened. And so Ezra spoke for God, who said, you must separate yourselves from these women, because they were practicing the things that pagans did back then. They practiced child sacrifice and temple prostitution, and they had turned their hearts away from God. So we find in Ezra that God actually commanded divorce. We also know that God himself divorced Israel and Judah when she worshiped idols and turned her heart away from God. We see that in Jeremiah 3, 6 through 10 and 20, and Isaiah 50, when God specifically told Israel that their hearts were turned against him, and so he divorced them because their hearts had turned against him. We know in the Old Testament, God made two covenants. One was a unilateral, unconditional covenant that he would send the Messiah through David. No matter what the people did, he was going to do this. But he also made another covenant. It was a bilateral, conditional covenant that he would bless them as long as they were his people and he was their God. But if their hearts were turned away, he would withdraw his blessing from them. And he told Israel that they were his bride and that he was the husband. And so we see in Deuteronomy 28 all the blessings they would get if their hearts were turned towards God, and all the things that would happen if their hearts turned away from God. So unlike some theology that says you have to stay in a marriage no matter what, God's marriage with Israel was a bilateral covenant that contained blessings if their hearts were turned toward him, and he would withdraw those blessings. And I think we need to follow his example. This is a marriage is a bilateral covenant. We are not required to stay in these relationships when someone has continued intentionally over time to reject the covenant vows that they have made to the other person. And that doesn't mean a woman needs to go and hurt the other person, but she withdraws from the relationship. And of course, the blessings that she brought with her are withdrawn. I've heard many times used as a weapon that God hates divorce, and they use that from Malachi 2. But when we look at what God was actually saying in Malachi 2, it's taken out of context. We actually find that when we look at it, God is admonishing men for acting treacherously to their wives by being unfaithful, by being unkind, by failing to protect them, by not raising godly children, and divorcing them for no reason. So God is really in that situation talking to the men about about not acting correctly to their wives. There is one translation that says God hates divorce, but most of them command husbands not to deal treacherously with their wives. So let's get that one out of the way. We talked about the Old Testament allowing for divorce. Exodus 21, 10 and 11, under Jewish laws, women were entitled to food, clothing, and love. These were called marital rights. These are the very minimum requirements that a husband was required to provide for his wife. And they are actually incorporated into the Jewish marriage contract. And if a husband did not provide for these, it was grounds for divorce. But let's look at Jesus's teachings on divorce, because that's another one that people look to. In Matthew 19, some rabbis came to the Pharisees actually came to Jesus and asked him how he was to interpret Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. So this divorce was the issue of the day. And the Pharisees' question was rooted in the controversy of how do you interpret Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. The other grounds for divorce were not on the table at the time. It was just this small thing. And Deuteronomy 24 allowed for divorce on grounds of indecency. So we had two different philosophies at the time. Rabbi Hillel, we'll call him the House of Hillel, and his students understood this indecency very liberally. They said a husband is allowed to divorce his wife for anything that's not up to snuff, even the quality of her cooking, burning the toast, whatever you have it. He can do it for anything. So that's what they thought that passage meant. But Rabbi Shammai thought that the indecency required divorce for adultery or lewd sexual behavior. And so these were the two competing decisions. But Jesus said, well, first of all, you're starting at the wrong place. We should start with why God had marriage in the first place, because it was supposed to be a lifelong contract. But he did say that Moses allowed for it for hardness of heart. But let's go to your question here. And he said the correct interpretation is not that divorce is required for sexual impropriety. And he used the word porneia for indecency, not the word for adultery. So it regards all sexual types of sexual sin. So the bottom line is taken as a whole. Jesus clarified that divorce is allowed, but not required in cases of adultery and pornography and other types of sexual sin. And divorce is also allowed for the ongoing sin or neglect or abuse due to a spouse's hardness of heart against the other spouse. And I want to put one more thing in here because we're going to wrap it up real quick. Paul had something to say on divorce as well. 1 Corinthians 7 says, Paul states, if a woman has a husband who's not a believer and he's willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. But if an unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or sister is not bound in such circumstances. And so oftentimes this gets misinterpreted to say, well, if you live with an unbeliever who still wants to stay married to you, even if he's abusive, and like most abusers, they don't want to get divorced, well, then you're stuck with them. But let's look at the original language that Paul used. He used the Greek word sunodokio for the word willing, which means in agreement and consenting in a hearty way and being of one mind and cooperative with the partners to reach solutions. He used the Greek word okeo for live, meaning to dwell comfortably and together like God dwells in us. And he used the Greek word apistos for unbeliever, a person who is not to be trusted and wicked and without trust in God. He used the Greek word chorizo for meaning leaves, which means separating or dividing both physically and relationally. And he used the Greek word eirene for peace, meaning harmony and security and safety and prosperity and happiness and free from danger. And finally, he used the Greek word douloo for bound, meaning make a slave of or bringing under subjection to the other person. So let's putting this all together. Paul is telling us that if a Christian is married to an unbeliever who, though not a Christ follower, is of one mind with her and is in agreement with her and respects her and loves her and is wholeheartedly committed to a healthy marriage and raising godly children and living in peace and harmony, then divorce is not really called for. But Paul recognizes that sometimes a spouse rejects God so much that it causes a serious and deep division, and it results in rage and havoc and a lack of harmony and a lack of safety and prosperity. And then the non-offending spouse is eventually treated as a slave in that situation. So Paul is stating that a person is not bound as a slave in this situation when someone has caused that division. So he recognizes that that would not, God wants us to live in peace and harmony, and not in a situation where we're being abused. So what does this all say? As church leaders and pastors, what do we do? I have a long list. Do we have time for this, Colin? What we need as attorneys? I think we do what attorneys should do. We do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God, and help those people out of the situations.
Yeah, I was going to say that if you would like to talk on this a little bit more, what we could do is we can just take like a few minute break. Would anyone else want a few minute break and then come back to it? And then we certainly have more time to get into that some more. So, okay, I'm seeing a thumbs up. So if you don't mind, what we're going to do is we're going to pause the recording and just give a 5-minute break so that people have time to use the restroom, refresh coffee or whatnot. And then we will come back and talk some more about some more of those topics, and even get to some questions and answers as well. So I'm going to pause the recording now.
So I just need to quickly discuss what we need to do as attorneys. And I think that's pretty obvious from what I've spoken about. Micah 6:8 says, "Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God." And throughout the Bible, it says, "Support the oppressed and those without a voice." I love Proverbs 31 verses 8 and 9, which says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly, and defend the rights of the poor and the needy." So as attorneys, I think that's our calling. But what does everybody else do? What do we do as a church leaders and pastors? In the book, I talk about 13 do's and don'ts, common mistakes, and things that we should do. But I'm not going to go through all those right now. But since I am from Chicago, I've put a little acronym in place because we are from the Bears. So with B, believe her. It's taken a great amount of courage for anyone to come forward and share this. Ephesians 5:11 tells us to expose evil, but so often the churches just want to sweep it under the rug. So believing her is a great start. Studies show that 95% of women exposing sexual abuse are truthful. So let's err on the side of actually believing her. If a woman is a church-going woman has been that, assume that she's going to be telling the truth. Don't think she's going to turn into a pathological liar, just at this point in time. E, educate yourself on domestic abuse. Take a class, read a book, read my book if you want. Domestic abuse is far more widespread, and people are far more evil than we like to think they are. So don't be played, particularly if you're in church leadership, because abusers are great at playing churches because they know they are somewhat innocent and try to believe people. So the abusers will deny and justify and mitigate the abuse and lie about the victim and play the victim. So just don't get played. A, hold the abuser accountable. The Bible tells us to impose church discipline in the hopes of bringing unrepentant sinners back to Christ. But how many churches really have the backbone to do that? Protect the sheep. Don't make your church a haven for the wolves. Let her worship in peace. And if he still wants to attend church, send to another church until he's able to repent and it's safe for her. And don't tell her to go back to an unrepentant abuser. R, refer her to domestic abuse professionals who have specialized training and resources. Don't give advice that can be dangerous. This is probably outside of most people's area of expertise. Don't give advice that says, go back and pray more and submit more and wear sexier clothes and all of this stuff. That's not going to work, and it's going to be dangerous for her. So don't engage in marriage counseling because, again, it's dangerous for her. Abusers use counseling to further inflict abuse. So send her to the professionals that know what they're doing. And then S, support her emotionally and financially. He will cut her off from access to funds if she ever had any access to funds. and he will likely not leave the house without a court order. So she'll need a safe place to live. So she needs to know that her family and her pastor support her against evil. So those are my quick, quick and dirty dub airs for all the other people that want to support her. So thank you for having me. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Charlene. Would you be able to give like a 5-minute rundown of what you do through your ministry?
Sure. I have a couple arms to my ministry. I serve as a family law attorney here in Lake County, Illinois, which is on the northern border of Illinois, borders Wisconsin. So I serve as a family law attorney. Most of my clients are women who are escaping domestic abuse of some sort. I get a lot of my clients from churches that refer clients to me, and other people, counselors, so on and so forth. The other thing I have is an organization called Abuse Care, and this organization does individual individual coaching for people who are trying to heal from domestic abuse. I also provide workshops and conferences for pastors and churches who are interested in knowing more about this, so that we can equip and educate pastors and church leaders on what the biblical response is to domestic abuse, because it's in nearly every church. I also have run a number of support groups, which we offer via Zoom. There's a local church that we meet in, and so we can meet in person, also via Zoom. So we have nationwide participants. Counselors in the area have asked me to help them, and this is when God has a sense of humor. When counselors with degrees and mental health degrees ask an attorney to come and help them start a support group for their domestic abuse clients. So I've started a couple domestic abuse support groups with local counselors here in the Lake County area. And of course the book, and teaching and advocacy and speaking on behalf of domestic abuse victims. So that it kind of runs the gamut of things. Thanks for asking.
Thank you, Charlene. We'll give a virtual round of applause to Charlene, and then we're going to open the floor to some questions. So I think the way we will do it is there aren't enough people to require a hand raising thing, I don't think, but we will do that if needed. So we'll just open the floor to questions, I think.
Yeah, happy to answer questions. Or maybe I just covered everything. I didn't know.
No, my husband and I were in church work for 30 years together. And, when there was a problem, he would deal with it. And there were some unpleasant things. There was a woman who was, just to give you an example, there was a woman in our church, new Christian, who was cooking books. And so he and the elders confronted her, and she got mad and she left the church. And I don't know, how many, have you met pastors who are willing to take this on and willing to take a loss when they do this confrontation? Have you met churches who have handled this correctly?
I've met a couple pastors who've done this right. Pastor Neil Shorey is a great example. Neil was the pastor to, I don't know if you guys heard about Drew Peterson, but he is the guy that was the police sergeant who has, 4 or 5 ex-wives now, and he was convicted of killing his third or fourth ex-wife, and so he was actually the pastor to his last wife, who just disappeared, and so of course we think that was killed as well. And then he tried to put a hit out on the prosecutor from prison. So he got prosecuted for that as well. But anyway, Neil, he was a young pastor when all of this went down. And here he is, we've got a sociopath, he's got a dead parishioner, he's got national news, so it's just, wow, it was a lot. So he decided he needed to, again, Lord, why me? And so he learned about domestic abuse and has become a very strong advocate for victims of domestic abuse. And so we speak together a lot. I've met a couple people at Trinity International University, where I used to serve as the Board of Regents, particularly one of the professors who's now retired, but he also is a counseling professor. So he knows how this type of personality works. I would say the pastor at my church has been very receptive. He's allowed me to hold conferences at the church for all the pastors in the region who wanted to attend. He gets it. I think there's a handful that do. But unfortunately, I've heard so many of my clients and other people who've gone through this, and they get this horrible advice from pastors who just don't get it.
Yeah.
So it's really disheartening, and it is my hope to change the church, how the church views this. I mean, there was literally a pastor from the Bronx. It made it to the video and went viral, who literally stood on the pulpit and said, the best person to rape is your wife, from the pulpit. So he was talking about submission. It was a Seventh-day Adventist pastor. So as soon as the denomination got wind of that, they took him out of the pastor role, and then they took him out of that. But imagine someone claiming from the pulpit that's being televised, that's being recorded, that just kind of tells you how far we are in some pastors' minds about this. It's and some denominations just seem to be a little bit more in the dark than others, particularly those that have a more of a patriarchal view and have I'll just say a male heavy leadership. Let's put it that way.
What kind of resources, like if you meet somebody who is dealing with signs of domestic abuse, what do you typically do? Do you point them to because I know that there are some resources that guide women in to escape and guide, because there are steps that they need to take in order to make that happen. So yeah, what are some of the starting points for people that you can recommend?
Certainly there's resources out there. I tried to make the book that I wrote as comprehensive as possible, to give her or anybody in that situation a big enough, everything you need to know type of thing. If she's actually trying to get out, there's a book called Enough is Enough, by a psychologist, who I think gives a good steps by step on the steps you need to do to get out. There's also there's an organization called domesticshelters.org, which it's kind of like a clearinghouse of all sorts of resources they have books, articles, and if you need an organization in your area, there's a whole list of organizations throughout the country. So I would, recommend that people go to their local domestic violence shelter, as well as finding things online to read about and educate yourself about it.
Okay, yeah, that's really good advice for those listening. DAIS is one of the big ones in Madison. I think that's Domestic Abuse Intervention Services or something like that, but it's DAIS. So that's a good resource around Madison for sure.
Okay, good. Most counties have a domestic abuse shelter or organization that provides at least counseling, sometimes resources, sometimes legal advocacy, sometimes places to live. It just depends on the funding of each organization, but most counties have that. And if you don't have one in your county, just keep calling local counties until you find someone that does.
So another question, if you suspect somebody is going through this, but they're not ready to leave yet, how do you support somebody like that?
Well, if they recognize it, they really have to be in a position to want to leave, because it is the hardest thing that she'll ever do. So she has to be ready, and there's a whole lot of reasons to stay. And she may just have to get herself ready. So I would say be supportive and say, I know that's difficult. And if she needs resources, give her resources so that she can, have those available. If I would also suggest that she, even while she's there, she can go to a support group or go to a counselor that can help her get mentally strong enough so that when the time comes, she can leave and not go back. A lot of times people stay because, well, finances, as we talked about, and maybe the children are in a very small and they need protection because, if not, he would get unsupervised time with the children, and that would be dangerous to them. So there's a lot of reasons why people stay. But during that time, she can start making plans to go, squirreling away a little bit of money so that she, a little bit at a time, getting herself mentally strong. If her kids are older and she needs to, come up with a plan on how she can leave and take her kids with her. And if they're old enough, they need to know that she's not leaving for no reason. There's a reason why she's leaving. So that's going to take a little time that she has to talk to the children on having a plan going forward. Maybe she has to have a physical safety plan that needs to be put in place, as well as a legal plan and a financial plan. So there's a lot of reasons. So just being supportive, and when she's ready to go, you can be there. Or if you can, open your home up. My husband and I have opened our home up as a safe house for people, and we say, okay, you're welcome to stay here, but you can't tell anybody where you're here. So that's another way to, really tangible way to help.
I don't want to take question time away, but I do have this thing that's been lingering with me for the last, I don't know, half a year or so. And it's the story in the Bible of Tamar's rape. And what was very disheartening to me, especially after the Me Too movement, was how David, this is what I really struggle with this. David he knew, he didn't do anything. He got a little bit angry at one point. That's the only record we have of any kind of reaction. And it was his son who had to take care of it. His son killed his half-brother rapist. Yet David we have nothing from him except his one instance of anger. Yet David was so affirmed and called a man after God's own heart. And I believe God, but I struggle with the silence. Have you ever worked through that? What do you think of that?
Well, David was in a really difficult position. And he, look what he did to Bathsheba. That wasn't just two consenting adults. He took her and raped her, because who's going to say no to the king?
Right.
So he did the same thing. So even though he was called a man after God's own heart, he was really not a good father. He had children that were, look at Solomon. He was a sex addict with 300 wives and 700 concubines. Absalom and all, they were just a mess. So he was not a good father by any stretch of the imagination, if you look at how his kids turned out. So yeah, it's concerning. I think he had a problem with bringing something out because he did it himself, like he took advantage of Bathsheba. And now is he going to tell his son, oh, well, you shouldn't do that? And his son's going to say, yeah, Dad, look what you did.
Yeah.
But you're right. And he paid the price for that.
And I mean, I think
Paid
that's
the
the only,
price.
I think that's the only redeeming thing for me. Not that I wanted to see any kind of revenge, but I guess what you could say is God saw it, and
Totally.
yeah, God saw it. But I just really struggle with the fact that it just feels like a little bit of patriarchy that, and I mean, if I say it out loud or I don't say it out loud, I feel like I'm affronting God a little bit and asking that, but he knows what I'm thinking.
Well, of course. And
Yeah.
David paid a big price for his mistakes. And when the prophet Nathan said, what you did in private, your son is going to do in public on the top of your cast, your palace. And that's exactly what happened when he left and Absalom came in and raped all his concubines. Well, okay, so he did pay a price for his sin, because all sin has a price to be paid. And he got it was just if you look at that, it was the second half of his life was a bit of a mess, and his children did not get along. But you're right, the silence is disturbing. But we look at throughout the Bible, there was not one person who could say, oh, and he was an excellent model. No, you look at Abraham, it's like he told his people that his wife was his sister, so he wouldn't get hurt, not only once but twice. So that wasn't exactly good. I mean, every single one of the people that God used had some issues.
Yeah. Well, and it's just sometimes the silence, it's maddening when there's silence and there should be some speaking up. I guess back then and even today, like you said, in the church too, it's a little maddening.
It's very aggravating when people are complacent and, let's not just rock the boat, because if we don't do anything, things will just calm down and she'll leave eventually. And that's what happens. So.
How is Trinity as far as this is going? So you said they have a counseling teacher and you are on the board of regents. And do you feel like in Christian circles, I mean, the last couple of years, especially, I suppose, since Me Too, you just get a little bit more aware of this. And, I have a friend who has gone through, marriage with a narcissist. And, looking back, I've known them since before they got married. And I could see everything you're talking about, but do you feel like people are becoming more aware, or that it's just like more of a one-by-one, case-by-case, word-of-mouth thing?
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer that question. I know the denominations that are still, primarily male-oriented and patriarchal and are they're still that way. Maybe they're getting a little bit better, but I can't say that there's been a wholehearted change.
So it's still kind of word of mouth, work with one person at a time, spread the message. Yeah.
Yep. I will say that I was invited to Trinity to speak on this subject matter by the former dean at the Divinity School. And we had a fairly large number of people that came, that mostly professors. And some of them were just in tears, men in tears.
Good. I'm sorry to say that, but I mean,
what I found is that every single person in an audience knows someone who's been affected by domestic abuse or themselves has been affected by domestic abuse. So, and in this case, someone came after me who was probably a 60-year-old man who told me about his mom, and he was just in tears, just remembering what she had gone through at the hands of her his dad, and all these many years, it still affected him. So it's a subject that runs throughout people in Christian circles and elsewhere as well. You remember those things as a child, and oftentimes they stay with you. And that's often why people choose the spouses that they do choose, because they've been raised in a dysfunctional family and that's normal to them.
And they've been programmed almost that way.
Yep.
When they're young. Yeah.
Yep.
So I think we're going to wrap up the initial questions and answers, and I know I think I'm going to try to allow for one more in case, because I thought I heard at the beginning that somebody had a particular question. But then I'm going to take the last 15 minutes essentially to talk about Christian legal aid. Unfortunately, we won't have the time right now to do kind of a primer on Wisconsin divorce and family law, but some links have already been shared, and if anybody is interested in helping with this cause, especially in Wisconsin, I would please encourage them to send me an email, because with Christian legal aid, this has been one of the biggest things that we have worked with is with victims of domestic abuse, because the need in the community is so great. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more, but like I said, I just want to give time for one more question in case there was somebody else who wanted to bring one. Okay, so like I said, I wanted to talk a bit about Christian legal aid. So you guys are probably all familiar with Christian Legal Society. It has the national structure and you have these chapters. Well, Christian legal aid, it has the national structure, but the Christian legal aid clinics themselves are a bit more disjointed for a number of reasons. They are, they're not subsidiaries. They exist as independent clinics, except for the fact that they're incredibly collaborative with the national and others. So while it is a separate clinic, in terms of the people, the structure and finances and whatnot, they collaborate a lot on processes, contracts, ideas, etc. So there's a lot of work together. So in Madison, me, Johnner, and Ryan Seib started Christian Legal Aid back in 2021, kind of that fall timeframe, with the mission of being a Christian legal clinic, where primarily where people can come to get a Christian attorney for whatever they need. And so our goal has essentially been to start by directing people to the right legal resources if they already exist, and doing it in such a way that has their spiritual needs met as well as, or Christian spiritual needs met, so if there is there's a neighborhood law clinic at the UW, there's consumer protection clinics at UW. So if they're comfortable with those types of clinics, we would refer them out and then check up on them to make sure that that there is quality representation, and that that their Christian values, if they are Christian, are being upheld in the process. And so if anybody is seeking particularly a Christian attorney, and or if there is there aren't attorneys to help out, that is where we step in. And for those who are financially in need, we step in on a pro bono basis, or if it's slight need, then low bono. So we put ourselves into the community this way. We've been working with Lighthouse Church through public intakes, and when we had people come to us, when we had women come to us who needed a divorce because they're abuse victims, we did reach out to the community to see, what kind of divorce attorneys are in the community. And the handful that are, we're just saying, we're swamped. We're absolutely swamped. And the question was never they were so swamped that they said, we don't even, the qualifications are not about whether or not you are a domestic abuse victim. The qualifications are how many children do you have, who are still minors. So they were just triaging. And this is, I just know this from medicine, so it's probably could be worse elsewhere, but they were just triaging at just a very fundamental level, trying to get kids into safer homes. And so we really took this on, and we were very blessed to have Sally McCarthy, who is experienced in family law and divorce law in Wisconsin. And so Sally McCarthy has been a mentor with Christian Legal Aid, and so we've been taking on right now, two divorces, and there were, we've spoken to another, but it was, a situation where the woman was just not ready to leave yet. So, we provided the set of resources that we could, and, the church provided her a space there as well as a resource. But that has really been the majority of of the legal needs that Christian Legal Aid has provided. And so essentially, at this point in time, we're kind of looking for more attorneys to help out, to give time. We're also kind of exploring other ways to provide these, to provide low bono, pro bono, in or even, have other attorneys who are just Christian attorneys who provide, their normal services, but they are Christian, so they're going to provide a better, more Christian experience for this, and make sure that, the divorce is a building experience for the woman with Christ. So we've been working with that, with exploring our options there, and I think that's going to be this is our biggest growing, the area we need to grow in right now because of the community need for domestic abuse victims. And I think, so like I said, if there are any attorneys that are interested at all in helping out, I would love for you to send me just a quick email with interest and how much time you might have, and you can even just say I'm interested, but I can't even say how much time, and we can potentially talk, depending on how invested you are able to get, and you don't even have to commit to anything until you're committing to take on a case. So essentially, yeah, we so once we kind of sort these things out, then we're going to be doing more open intake clinics at the local churches. We had a few about a year ago, but since then, like I said, we've been kind of swamped. We've been swamped ourselves, without more attorneys stepping in to help. So what I think what we're going to do then is, so Sally was going to provide a primer in family law for anyone who is interested. Just send me I was going to say, send me an email of your interest. So you can either send me an email if you're interested in helping out. You can put it in the survey that I linked, the Google Form survey. But if you would be interested in getting this primer on family law, but not necessarily interested in helping out, just put that in the survey, and on your way out, and then we can kind of schedule something like that for a future meeting. But yeah, essentially, just for those interested, these divorce cases take well over a year. Oftentimes, the the abuser, the husband, is not cooperative at all, and as Charlene said, and so you may hear of divorce attorneys talking about, oh yeah, this is it's a simple divorce case, it's just some assets, no minor children, you can have this probably wrapped up by the time the required 120 days is up, and um, I that's probably not the case, because it's going to be, you're going to say, okay, well, we'll just find out what assets there are. Well, he's not going to tell you, so and if there are kids involved, there's a whole mediation process for placement, and whether or not there's a need for a restraining order, or a restraining order as well can have a major effect um, on how that case goes. So it is usually well over a year. So it is a bit of a commitment once you get into it, but hopefully with the Christian legal aid attorneys, if we, I'm working with this. David Jones has been working a little bit with this as well. And Sally McCarthy is the mentor, and she's been wonderful. And so it has been, it has been quite a challenge, and we're, every day we're learning more and more. But yeah, Sally McCarthy's been a wonderful mentor. So if you're interested, shoot me an email, and if you're just interested in hearing the Family Law Primer, put it in the Google Form survey. So I'm going to open the floor to any more questions or comments or anything like that.
I will make one comment on that. And well, it's a long process and it's very frustrating. It is so rewarding to help change the lives of these people. And my bulletin board and my refrigerator is plastered with pictures of the kids that I've helped, and thank you cards, and I get invitations to weddings. And it's really wonderful to be able to help people. And then that the people, God's blessings follow his people. And so I get to see these ladies go back to school, go back to college, get their master's degree. They become teachers and counselors, and one is just getting her law degree as well, to go and to help other people. So they do really well. And it's just great to see that once they get through this mess that you can help them with, to see them, get on with their lives and do great things and be invited to all these wonderful milestones as someone who's played an important role in their life. So I'm just giving a shout out to to that.
I agree with that. I would say it's for me, I think it's just been amazing to see what's in store for God's children. So that's been amazing to me. I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say like, oh, it's going to warm your heart all the time and everything like that. In fact, it's like pretty tough most of the time. But these people are coming, coming asking for help for a very important reason. And so, I think as Christians, we need to be there for them, especially with the fact that, I think when you see, as, it progresses and you see this person that they are becoming in Christ, I think that is where you see this hope in Christ that, we hear so much about in the Bible. It's just one of the most prominent examples of that, from, taking somebody coming to you in an incredibly dark space, and it looks maybe not hopeless, but it seems very hopeless in a lot of moments. And later on, just the development into an independent person, a person who has wonderful faith and acts out that faith in a very supportive way to others, after they themselves have been developed their own independence. So it's a wonderful mission. And like I said, I do encourage people to get involved if they have any interest whatsoever. So I'm going to end the recording now, just in case anyone has any other thoughts that they just don't want to say on the recording. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Charlene. And
My pleasure.